Jon Fortt, anchor of CNBC's Squawk Alley and host of the Fort Knox podcast. So please do check that out. Brad, glad to sit down with you. This is a big issue, cyber warfare, because we're in the midst now of a flurry of attacks, the likes of which we haven't seen for a while. First, it was WannaCry, which was ransomware. Basically, we'll give you back your data if you give us a bunch of money in Bitcoin, to this latest one, Petya, which is just destroying systems, basically. Give us a sense of the scope of this problem and what's changed over the past few years.
Well, it's a great question, John. And first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming and showing an interest in what we certainly believe is one of the really important issues of our time. And so you might ask, well, why? Well, first, we're sort of seeing the digitization of everything. And if that hasn't yet run its course, it clearly will continue to do so. So, as we rely on digital devices for everything, if those devices stop working, the economy stops working. Hospitals stop working. One of the companies that has been afflicted this week is one of the world's largest shipping companies. And as a result, ports, in some cases, have stopped working. Unloading of ships has slowed down. And so it shows how reliant we are on all of this digital technology. Now, at the same time that we've become more reliant on the technology, we have seen increasing efforts by people, in some cases criminals, in some cases individual hackers, increasingly governments, nation states, focused on how to exploit vulnerabilities in this technology.
And in this case of these latest two attacks, particularly WannaCry, there are actually government-developed exploits from the NSA. Somebody got a hold of and used those to actually perpetrate the attack. So it's like, it's like weapons from the U.S. in essence. Secret weapons got out into the wild and caused a lot of this.
Yeah, at this point, I think there are at least three things we know about this WannaCry attack, which took place in May. The first is the vulnerability it exploited, and the exploit, meaning the technology that was used to get into people's computers, was developed and then stolen from the National Security Agency, the NSA. Second, it then went on to the black market. There was a group called the shadow brokers. It ended up in the hands of what I now think one can fairly conclude was in fact a group that is the same group that attacked Sony and that the FBI has connected with the government of North Korea.
So you feel confident in that?
Yes, based on the data that we've seen, that we've had access to, and the data that we've shared and analyzed together with other companies and with people in government. And then what this entity did was it, in effect, weaponized the exploit. It added what engineers would call a payload, and in this case, the payload was designed to take control of someone's hard drive and cause the hard drive to become inaccessible unless someone paid $300, the so-called ransom. So the payload was referred to as ransomware.
So that's $300 per machine.
Per machine.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that is so significant and important about the WannaCry attack, and by the way, we're seeing the exact same thing this week with this so-called Petya attack, is that there's a variety of ways that these kinds of exploits can spread. The worst form is what people in the industry would refer to as a worm, or what in effect involves remote spreading. It gets onto a computer, and then it seeks to replicate itself by moving to other computers within a network and then across networks. In the WannaCry case, no one will perhaps ever know for certain, but the conclusion was that it, in fact, infected over 200,000 computers in over 150 countries.
Wow. That's a lot of money, potentially, if you calculate the percentage who really care about the data on that machine and are willing to pay up in order to have it released.
And one of the interesting questions about WannaCry is what was, in fact, the motivation. That's even harder by far to discern than the identity of the entity that launched the attack.
You don't think it was money?
Well, if it was money, it was a very crude form. Most ransomware attacks for money are actually pinpoint attacks. They go much deeper and they ask for a lot more money. This was what we would call indiscriminate. And so it may have been to raise money. It may have been simply to inflict broad damage. It may have been to send a signal that in a world where there is rising tension between the government of North Korea and other governments, that the North Koreans have some additional weapons that the world needs to worry about.
Might it have been to, like a missile test, to test the effectiveness of spreading something along this vector? And one of the ways you can tell if somebody got the message is if they choose to pay a ransom.
It is, I think we're now entering the world of speculation. There's what
I live there.
Yeah, every day. And there's what we know and what we don't know. And the truth is, we don't know today. I don't know if we'll ever know for certain what the precise motivation was. What we do know about what's happening this week with this Phishing attack is that it is based on one of the same vulnerabilities that was at the heart of the WannaCry attack. There's also a second exploit that also people believe was part of what was stolen from the NSA last year, and that overall it's frankly more technically sophisticated than what we saw just a month ago.
Which brings us to the idea of a Geneva Conventions for cyber warfare. I'm not confident that North Korea would particularly respect the Geneva Conventions that we already have for more traditional warfare. I also did a little reading up on Geneva Conventions. And one of the things that jumped out at me about the original purpose back in 1864 initially, it actually wasn't so much about rules around weaponry. It was around protecting the innocents. And the Red Cross rose out of that. So let me ask you, as part of this suggestion of a Geneva Conventions for cyber warfare, do we need a digital Red Cross? Do we need an international band of white hat hackers who actually respond to attacks like this?
I think the short answer is that we need something like that, at least in a somewhat similar form. Specifically, what we called for and what I called for in a speech I gave in February was three things. First, an international agreement between governments that would start to regulate the use of this cyber weaponry or other hacking technology that would prohibit certain types of acts, regulate others, but an agreement between governments. And that's one thing to actually talk about. The second was an agreement that would bring the tech sector together. Because the truth is, the tech sector is two things that we were not a decade or so ago. One is we are the plane of attack, if you will. It is our products that are the surface area. And second, because of that, we are the first responders. And I believe that the only way to increase defensive effectiveness is to bring the industry together with a series of concrete commitments and steps we'll take. And third, we need what people would call an attribution organization. Think about the International Atomic Energy Agency. That has obviously existed so that there would be some kind of body that could go out and investigate whether a country was seeking to build a nuclear weapon. In the same vein, one of the things that I think we're going to need in order to combat this problem is the ability to identify and then validate basically what I said a little while ago. Oh yes, WannaCry, that is in fact something that was connected with a group that the FBI is connected with the government of North Korea. And it, we believe, should probably be a non-governmental organization, but one could design it in other ways as well. But we're going to need a series of things if we're going to deal with what I think can fairly be called a new era of invisible weapons. That's the only effective approach that we're going to have to pull together.
So if we combine the Geneva Conventions and various amendments and The Hague, you get things like rules around treatment of prisoners of war, massively destructive weapons, what to do about those. What are some of the basic, broad, perhaps, or even specific outlines of the types of rules that we need?
I think that it's the right question, and the answer has two parts. And interestingly, if you study the history of these kinds of things, they both go back to the 1860s and then have built ever since. The first are rules around the weapons themselves. The modern era of trying to prohibit or regulate weapons actually started in 1868 when there was an international agreement among European countries where they agreed they would not use dum-dum or hollow bullets because of the devastating impact they would have on combatants. And then by the 1890s, that led to debates around chemical weapons. By 1925, there was a Geneva Protocol prohibiting chemical weapons. And of course, more in our lifetimes, we've seen things around nuclear weapons and the like. So you have a set of rules around what weapons are permitted or not, how are they managed and controlled. Then you have a second concept, which I just think is of fundamental importance. And it does go back to the Red Cross and then what became the Fourth Geneva Convention, which was adopted in 1949. And the basic principle underlying it was that even in times of war, governments would try to protect civilians. And to me, the reason that is so important to think about right now is, in fact, in most of the world, we're living in a time of peace. But think about the attacks that are taking place against civilians. Jon Podesta is and was a civilian. His computer was exploited, not for the purpose of vandalizing it, but for the purpose of stealing information so as to damage, what I would argue, damage another part of civilian infrastructure, the infrastructure of our democracies. Think about WannaCry and the way it was targeted, whether intentionally or because of its design, which was designed to have a broad indiscriminate effect on hospitals, on electrical infrastructures, on businesses, on individuals. We need, I believe, to persuade the world that even if they're going to develop cyber weapons for military use against other governments, we should at least build on what we learned through such enormous pain, that we shouldn't have governments using those weapons against civilians.
But there we run into the attribution challenge, right? Because there's the kid in the neighborhood who might be trying to hack into Wi-Fi routers and then and end up reading people's email. And then there's the case of somebody actually hacking into Jon Podesta's email and trying to perhaps undermine confidence in our democratic system. How do you tell the difference between the two?
Well, interestingly, I think that the technology sector has become increasingly capable in identifying, not every time, but many times, who is behind an attack. And the issues, therefore, are in part having mechanisms that enable us to pool our data, because you end up being able to discern much more with a pool of data. I think you do need objective, independent, respected experts who will evaluate the data. And then I think you need a respected, independent organization that will publish its conclusions. It is difficult for a company that has employees in a particular country, that has customers in a particular country, to stand up and say, we know exactly who was behind this attack. It was the government of country fill in the blank. Because we put our customers at risk, obviously we put our business under some pressure. Most importantly, in my mind, we put our employees at risk. And just being completely candid, it's easier to talk about North Korea than almost any other country, because it's the one country where we're not allowed to have employees or do business.
What do you do about, though, the geographical challenge? Okay, so if we have use of chemical weapons in Syria, the first thing, I guess, is to prove that chemical weapons were probably used. You can have video that kind of shows that, yes, that looks like a chemical weapon attack, somebody. And then chances are, whoever perpetrated that attack, well, it was somebody who was actually physically there. It was either, the Syrian government or, the rebels who are fighting the Syrian, and you sort of have the argument about it, well, was it side A or was it side B? In the digital realm, not only, I think, are most people not used to thinking about networks and data in a sophisticated way that leads to attribution, but an attack that happens here could have started literally anywhere in the world. It's not just A, B, it's A through Z and beyond who possibly could have done it, right?
I think it's really useful to think a little bit about chemical weapons and to think about them in the context of Syria. And what I would say is this: the second thing people had to do was decide whether chemical weapons had been used. The third thing they had to do was decide who had used them. But what was the first thing the world had to do? it had to decide, as it did a century ago, that the use of chemical weapons was unacceptable. Think about how different it would be dealing with the Syrian situation if the world had never come to that conclusion. And when you think about the incredible horrors of World War II, there's something that is quite remarkable about it. Because chemical weapons had been prohibited, the combatants never used them on each other. The Nazis used them on citizens, on civilians, which was a big part of what sparked the Fourth Geneva Convention 4 years after the war ended. But what it really says to me is that while people always worry about all the difficulties, and the difficulties are real, we need to, I believe, always remember that you are so much better able to deal with those difficulties if you have a foundation of having brought the world together to agree that certain things must be off limits.
Now, my timing might be off a bit here, but I believe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a piece of malware called Stuxnet, right? And it ended up infecting Iranian nuclear facilities that were, at the time, I think, believed to be civilian facilities. Whether they were eventually going to be used for some other purpose, a different discussion. But all indications were that the Israelis or the US or some combination was actually responsible for spreading the Stuxnet virus into the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Under this, would that be a war crime?
Well, I won't answer the question head on, but I will say this. It points to one of the important things that people have to grapple with whenever you decide that you want to consider putting certain areas of government conduct off limits. Because what you're fundamentally talking about is new law. And then what people often gravitate towards, and I find this working with lawyers all the time in the tech sector, is everybody wants to go worry about the edge case. Okay, is the edge case of one military using a cyber weapon to damage the nuclear reactor that is being used, they believe, to process plutonium for purposes of creating a nuclear weapon, is that a military attack or is it an attack against civilian infrastructure? People will have to decide. But what I always think it's so important to guard against is never let the edge cases stop you from reaching fundamental agreement on the core.
But aren't the governments who are presented with this idea going to do exactly the opposite? They're going to take the edge cases and go, okay, what are we doing that we really want to keep doing that might not be okay under these rules? And are we okay with not doing that anymore?
Absolutely, that is an important part of this whole dynamic. But I will still argue, look, let's take the United States government for a minute. You know, there may be people in the United States government who will have the point of view, which I would think is one that is worth thinking through seriously. Let's imagine that it's not a nuclear reactor in Iran, but a nuclear processor in North Korea. And there will be important questions that need to be considered. Is that off limits or not? But let's not let that obscure the answers to certain other questions. Should the attack of hospitals be off limits? Should the attack of politicians and political parties running for office be off limits? Should the attack on electrical utilities in times of peace be off limits? I believe the answer to all of those should be yes. Or just about the nature of weapons themselves. There is a huge difference, I would argue, between a weapon that has a very precise target, a specific set of computers in a specific facility associated with, say, a nuclear reactor, versus one that is designed to spread remotely to every machine on the planet. So I would actually say, look, we don't have any laws yet in this space. We've had norms that have started to emerge. If we can't yet figure out the answer to every question, let's start by answering the questions that we believe are answerable. We can always then have more time to build on that foundation or not.
So what kind of a response have you gotten from the governments of the world?
Well, it's interesting because the truth is the number of governments in the world that have invested in creating an offensive capability is actually relatively small.
How do we know?
To the best of our knowledge.
Okay.
It's a fair point. To the best of our knowledge, the number of governments that have really invested in creating an offensive capability is relatively small.
Does that include the number of governments who know a guy who can access an offensive capability pretty quickly on demand?
Probably not, because everybody, look, in you can, with the internet, if you don't know a guy, you can find a guy.
Right.
But what I'm really getting at is most governments actually have focused principally or exclusively on defensive protection. And those governments have actually very quickly said, yes, we need to do this because this is really about strengthening defense. And then you have a smaller number of governments that have an offensive capability, and there you do have these more complicated questions, including the one that you just framed. And look, my point of view overall is we all should approach this subject with a sense of humility. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody does. I will say this. We need to have a conversation about this. This needs to be an issue of national and even global discussion. When nuclear weapons were created, there was a broad discussion in the United States, in the Congress, which parts of the military would be able to build them, to have access to them, to use them. How would they be maintained? How would they be secured so they wouldn't be stolen? All of these things. And here we are in this new era of weapons, and that conversation is just beginning. It's almost an overstatement to say it has begun. And as much as anything else, our message is this is important, it matters to the future of the world, and we need to bring the public into this. It's too important to leave simply to subject matter experts.
We have an administration right now in the US, and possibly to a greater degree, we have a public that seems to be skeptical of broad international agreements, whether it's things like the UN, which it seems like a generation ago only black helicopter-fearing conspiracy theorists were skeptical of, or whether it's the EU or its trade agreements that work broadly across an entire region. Is something like this going to meet with similar skepticism in Trump's America today, or do you think this is different?
I think that there actually are greater headwinds politically, not just in the United States, but in some other cases, to an international agreement. Just in any country that might be less enthused about being part of an international organization or advancing the United Nations or embracing international agreements or trade or you name it. There is no doubt, as you actually, I think quite rightly point out, John, that at the moment, it's harder than it was in the past to stand up and say, the world needs some law that spans borders, which is also why I think it's important for those of us who are so familiar with the dangers that are becoming so manifest to stand up and use our voice. I'm struck, for example, it was on January 17th, 1961, Dwight Eisenhower decided in a way that presidents had not for quite a long time to give a farewell address. And he studied George Washington's farewell address, and he chose to use his farewell address to talk about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. And his basic point was that the private sector and the military had this collective interest in promoting more weaponry. Well, interestingly, I would argue that in the 2017 era, the relationship between the government and the tech sector is and should be actually rather different. Because we're not the manufacturers of the weapons, although companies can be if they choose. We're the plane of attack. We understand what is going on. We are in the best position next to the governments themselves to be the first responders to protect people around the world.
And so the relationship should be what?
I think we should be doing what we are doing. It should be one of what I will call a good discussion, but a little healthy tension. We should be saying, wait a second. Before the world rushes headlong and creates more of these weapons that make the public more unsafe around the world than it is today, we need to have a national and even global conversation about the world we are creating and how we manage it better. And I'll even go farther to say, we think that these things should be managed by governments. They should be managed pursuant to law. There is a role for international law. But by the way, if governments don't want to, if they can't, we can take steps ourselves to protect customers around the world. And that's why part of the things that I've called for is a principle that says, as an industry, we have to be clear. We will never help any government attack any customer anywhere. We will protect every customer everywhere. We're committed to 100% defense, 0% offense. I don't know of any other way to try to keep the world safe with all of this digital technology.
Now, how far does that definition of 100% defense go? Because I'll tell you, one of the first things that came to mind for me when I heard about the what was at the core of WannaCry and what had happened with shadow brokers was, boy, these are the same folks that wanted Apple to build a backdoor into the iPhone. And it's not to say PCs aren't important. They are very, 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 very important, Microsoft. But imagine if everybody's iPhone suddenly went blank and a ransomware message came up and said, if you want to use your iPhone again, pay me $300. Like, oh my goodness. People would freak out, right? Right?
There's one person who I won't point to who's sitting here freaking out today because his company isn't able to use any of his computers. He's raising his hand right there. No, I mean, believe me.
Imagine if they couldn't use their phones, right? Would you be here today?
When one of the world...
Said he would be here because he doesn't want to be there.
When one of the world's most prominent and successful and respected shipping companies needs to post on its website, don't worry, our ships are still under our control. That shows you how much is at stake, whether it affects everybody's iPhone or not. But where you're going, I think, is this. Look, there's a complexity of issues here. We do believe in a world where we need to be governed by law. The public needs to be kept safe. Civil liberties need to be protected. Part of that is giving governments the ability to access information pursuant to lawful process and the rule of law in an appropriate way that protects human rights. Now, then you get into these complexities around encryption and the like, but fundamentally, the real point, and you were basically alluding to it, is we shouldn't want a world where there are backdoors, because backdoors can be exploited by anybody who can find them. And in fact, what you're really talking about when you are talking about something like WannaCry or this week Petya is vulnerabilities, not backdoors, but cracks. Cracks that people are figuring out how to exploit. And if anything, that should, I believe, cause us to be even more circumspect about what it would mean to have backdoors.
So when the government comes to you and says, we would like a backdoor into Windows 10 because we think that's very important to preventing terrorist attacks, which we believe are being planned on hybrid devices. You say...
what I said publicly was the path to hell starts at the back door. And so therefore the answer is no. It's just not a tenable option. It's something that makes the world more dangerous, not more safe. It doesn't mean that there are not regimes that one can envision where people have keys and the government can go, require that they turn them over. That has its own set of issues. But I think backdoors have just so much more downside than upside that, mostly as I think you've seen over about the last 18 months, public interest in a backdoor turned out to be pretty short-lived.
And the difference between a backdoor and a key is that a key works to a specific house and is under control of the owner, whereas a backdoor opens every house?
That is one important difference. I mean, imagine today that we live in houses, they have locks, they have keys. If the FBI shows up at your house with a warrant that's been approved by a magistrate, your home, you answer the door, you have to let them in. If you happen to be out on your sidewalk in front of your home, you do have to use the key to let them in. So there are scenarios that one can imagine in a whole host of possibilities. But that's very different from saying, you know what, let's create some magic door that every door maker in America will make so that the FBI never needs to ask for the key. They can just go in when they want, with or without a warrant.
Please get your questions ready. We've got microphones around the room. I see there are already questions ready, and I will let the folks with the microphones grab those. And in the meantime, as they're getting those, I'll ask a follow-up question. I asked about a digital Red Cross, which I think is a little bit different from an attribution organization. It would be, I guess, an organization that responds to civilians who have been hurt by a particular attack. You think we need that?
I think we absolutely need that role to be fulfilled. I don't think it will ever be fulfilled by a non-governmental organization that resembles what the Red Cross is, which I think is one of the world's great organizations.
Why not?
I just think that the level of technical complexity is so great and so multifaceted. The truth is, and I said this in recent weeks, I think those of us in the industry actually have the first responsibility to respond, and I don't.
But you also have a profit motive, so it's
which is why I'm not claiming we're the Red Cross.
Okay.
You know, and I don't expect anybody is ever going to look at Apple or Microsoft or Google or Facebook or you name it and say, oh, they're the Red Cross. Doesn't mean our responsibility is any less high. The truth is, these are our products that people are using. It is our products that are being attacked. We are in the best position to actually be the first responders. So I won't nominate ourselves to be the Red Cross, but I do think we have to assume a responsibility to be the first responders. And what that means is several things which we're working to fulfill. One is that we actually are dedicating substantial resources to analyzing all the threats. We have inside Microsoft what's called the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, constantly analyzing these new threats. We then have a cyber defense operations center. So this week, typical week when these things happen, the first thing that happens is we're getting news reports, and within minutes, not just hours, but minutes, we've got people in the Threat Intelligence Center going out to try to get a sample of the code that's being used in the Ukraine so we can get it, and our engineers can reverse engineer it. They can understand what is it, what is the payload, what kind of weapon is it, how is it trying to propagate itself, where does it look like it came from, how do we protect people against it. The Cyber Defense Operations Center goes to work. One of the first things we do is we create a new antivirus signature. We get it out to the world so that everybody that's got antivirus software automatically gets it installed, and they have an additional source of protection. We then put our engineers to work. We have had engineers working around the clock around the world with the customers who have been suffering these attacks. And that goes down to sort of entry-level engineers up to the CEO, working with customers in this kind of environment. We have a third group called the Digital Crimes Unit. Well, we'll go to work and we will use legal process, as we have in over 90 countries since last July, to then do what we can to disrupt the nation-state attacks. These are typically where we're more likely to be effective is when they're hacking and trying to steal people's information or credentials. But I believe we've got to keep getting more robust in all of those areas. We've got to do it individually. We've got to do it with other companies. We've got to do it in collaboration with responsible governments. And I do believe there is a role for non-governmental organizations, and maybe one of them will emerge as a digital Red Cross. I don't quite see the path yet, but I would be the last person to exclude the possibility.
Okay, questions?
Hi. So almost half of my Facebook feed now is ads for virtual private networks. And I can see a lot more people using them now, and it's a booming business. And I'll definitely never go online back home in Moscow without a VPN on my phone. But how really secure are they? Do they really improve security, VPNs?
How secure are virtual private networks? And I guess you're running your traffic essentially through somebody else's server. It's probably pretty important that you trust whose server that is.
I think that is. I think that every network has its share of risk. The thing that is most interesting is that a high percentage of security can be advanced through a certain number of just sort of fundamental security steps. If you're using a VPN and you're in Russia and you're worried about it, then the first thing you can do is use a program, including features in our software, to encrypt your data. And so, if I were worried about a VPN in a particular country, I would use encryption for my emails and my attachments, and then I would feel a whole lot more confident. It's fascinating because for institutions large and small, then there's a set of other steps that are relatively limited in number that are not that technically sophisticated, but it just shows how much there's a sort of shared responsibility to help educate people and make these things easier. You know, if there were to be one next thing I would recommend, whether I'm using a VPN or not, it would be what's called two-factor or multi-factor authentication, which you can use with Facebook or Twitter or email or you name it, and that basically means in addition to your password, you know, you are using authentication through a physical device that you have, like a phone, or maybe it's something in your body like a fingerprint or a retina scan, or with Windows Hello, it's actually a facial scan. And that way, if somebody hacks your system and steals your password, they're not actually able to penetrate your account. I will digress for a moment and say one of the things that we notice hackers doing is when they first penetrate a system, they may not know how long they have access to it. And so oftentimes the first thing they do is they access your email and they do a search of your email. Guess what word they search for?
Password.
Password. Because it is a common practice for people, because you can't remember all of the passwords, to send yourself an email with your password. 2 lessons. 1, don't send yourself an email with your password. 2, if you do send an email with your password, don't use the word password. Come up with some different word that you can always remember. But then beyond that, the importance of patching systems. The customers that were attacked this week, we don't believe current with their patches. Update to the latest software. For enterprises, segregate network resources so it's not possible for somebody who gets into one place to get into every place. These things are not that lengthy, they're not that complicated, but they are hard. We need as an industry to make them easier, and institutions, frankly, need to allocate resources and people time to address them. I think in the world today, one of the challenges is that the IT staff is often recognized and rewarded for implementing the latest cool thing, but they're not recognized and rewarded for mastering the technology fundamentals. Isn't it great? Every machine has been patched. Instead, they're just blamed when things go wrong. And so there's a culture, I think, around security that we're all going to need to evolve in order to strengthen defensive protection.
See more questions?
I was just wondering, you briefly mentioned working with governments, but I really wonder, if you talk about corporations as the main actors of online security, what does that mean for corporate accountability? And who gets to decide what is secure and what's not, and who bad actors are and who bad actors aren't? I just worry about putting all of that power into non-governmental, into corporate hands to decide what should happen on the internet.
Well, I generally agree with you. I believe we should live in a world where everyone is subject to the law. No individual should be above the law, no government should be above the law, and no company should be above the law. Which is why, to be honest, I sometimes find it ironic when we advocate that there be new law in this space, to which we would be accountable, as well as others, as well as this effort by the industry to work together. And then I sometimes meet people in government who say, we don't want any law, we don't want the government in this, but you all should go do your thing. Look, I think we should go do what we need to do to help make the world safer, but I completely agree that we need a world with law to which we're all accountable.
Yeah, hi. So the Geneva Convention for the Internet sounds great and all, but I guess probably what a lot of us consumers wonder at this point is why would we even need that? Because we tend to think of companies like Microsoft and many of the other American technology companies as just being fantastically smart, hiring the best people, unlimited resources. And so from our point of view, it would seem like such a ridiculous one-sided battle that surely you guys as an industry would have fixed all this by now, and we would have a much more pleasant computing experience both at home and at work. Could you address that? Thank you.
Sure. No, it's more than a fair question, and I think we always need to keep raising the bar upon ourselves to strengthen the defensive capabilities and just the sheer resilience of software. Now, at the end of the day, if you analogize to the physical world, software is probably more like glass than steel. given the way it is made, given the way it changes, given all of the complexities that are demanded of it. But we should be working to create bulletproof glass, and that's what we need to do every day. Now, I will say, though, imagine you have a door that has bulletproof glass, but you forget to lock it. That is part of the challenge that the world faces, and that really underscores the degree to which security is a shared responsibility. And over 90% of all security attacks actually start the same way, through what's called a phishing attack, which is basically when somebody goes and clicks on a link, doesn't recognize where they've gone, and enters their password, and they've suddenly surrendered access to their computer or their company's computer system to a hacker. And as somebody remarked at this conference I spoke at in San Francisco in February, every company has at least one employee who will click on anything. So now you know why I think this is an issue of broad concern. The other thing that I would just pause and reflect on is, what is one of the biggest public issues of discussion in the United States in the year 2017? It's what happened to our electoral process in the year 2016 that involved a certain foreign government. And what was the base step that was part of that? It was the same act of hacking. And so this is where I do believe that the world would be better served if we had an international agreement that said it is impermissible for governments to use these kinds of techniques to seek to hack and steal information or otherwise disrupt the fundamental infrastructure of democratic polities, meaning the people who are running for office. And when we look back at what we can discern from what happened in the United States in 2016, or even when we look at the pattern that we were able to follow in France in 2017, we would say we should bring together the governments of the world. And while I would respect the views of people who might be in the US government or some others who would say, look, there are these edge cases around which we don't want to reach agreement, I would say, yes, but cannot we reach agreement that the democratic politics or electoral processes should be off limits? And they'll say, yes, but others will violate that. And I'll say, yes, and the Syrians will use chemical weapons. And yes, we're better able to deal with those threats when we have this understanding that that is something that should not be tolerated.
More questions up front?
Okay, thank you very much. I have two observations I would like your reflections on. One is about the degree to which we're maybe blowing hacking out of proportion. If you look at the invention of things that have made a lot of progress in our lives, from the advent of shipping to retail, credit cards, the usurpation of value by counterfeit measures, by corruption, has just been internalized as part of the business model of these types of inventions. So you see fraud being a very, very big phenomenon in the world, but it's not something that prevents us from buying things online. This is one thing I'd like to sort of put out there for you. On the other side, there's a lot of reference to nuclear weapons and how we came to some form of stability over norms and usage and whatnot. In a past life, I was a nuclear non-proliferation analyst working in Canada on the situation in the Middle East. And the thing I learned there are many schools of thoughts about how we got there, but most was the proliferation of those arms into multiple hands created scenarios of mutually assured destruction, which prevented anyone from using them. It prevented anyone from getting close to the thought of using them. So instead of maybe setting up institutions, should more people have access to the technologies, and if they use them, they would have very, very severe counter incentives for doing so.
Those are great observations, and I'd offer a few thoughts. First, I don't think that we're letting concerns get out of hand. Now, if somebody said, I'm so concerned about hacking that I don't want to use the internet, and I don't want to use a computer, and I just want to write on a yellow piece of paper and send things across town with a courier, I might say, you lost me there. I think that's going too far. So, things can get out of hand, but that's not where we are today. I think that, to the contrary, it's right to be focused and concerned, and to be concerned now for a couple of reasons. One is this technology has already become such a fundamental part of our societies, but it is going to become even more a part. Imagine what havoc can be wreaked if we're not driving our cars, if our cars are driving themselves, which really means if computers are driving our cars, if all of those computers are connected to the internet, which they will be, and if someone could hack 3,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 cars simultaneously. The time to focus on these problems is now, not after we find that cars have been driven into each other and people have been injured or killed. So that's the first thing I would say. In a world where there's going to be AI and autonomous everything, this is going to get more complicated, not less so. The second thing that gives me great pause is that while we see the most sophisticated technology in this space in the hands of nation states, it's not confined to nation states. We're definitely seeing a growing surge of hacking and criminal fraud and the like. And I think you're right to say yes, and that's true of credit cards as well. But it is showing that criminal groups are getting better at hiring people with the coding expertise to engage in this same kind of activity. I find it disconcerting that there are two other developments associated with that. One is increasingly we're seeing those activities sort of launched from countries that the rule of law does not reach. So it's harder to prosecute them when we can identify them.
For example?
Western Africa, is a place to worry a lot about. But second, the other problem that I'm seeing is that even when we can identify these people and we can prosecute them because they are in countries where there is a strong rule of law, frankly, most companies are very reluctant to do so. We supported and brought last week a case to the United Kingdom where law enforcement arrested two individuals, got a lot of press in the UK. And so, of course, we had to make public that these individuals had attacked Microsoft network resources. And most companies don't want to do that. They just want to move on to the next thing. They don't want to have to deal with the reputational conversation that ensues. But I worry a lot that if we don't have courage to fight crime, we just create a future where crime spreads more broadly. And then there's the final thing that I think is the most pertinent to your point about nuclear weapons and why I don't see this as the same. At least so far, thank goodness, it has been very difficult, or at least to date impossible, for terrorist organizations to either steal or develop nuclear weapons. But when we're talking about cyber weapons, we're talking about things that have gone missing or been stolen from the world's most sophisticated intelligence agencies. When we see these things show up on the black market, or when we see what a relatively small group of 22-year-old people can create, I think we should all worry. But frankly, it's a lot easier to persuade 22-year-olds to create cyber weapons than it is to strap dynamite on their chest to blow up people in a bus. And if we don't address these problems head on now, I really fear that we're going to find ourselves coming together for the first time later after they've gotten worse.
Also, Brad, does mutually assured destruction work in a digital realm where the goalposts for destruction are constantly moving? Today's nuclear digital attack is tomorrow's pea shooter attack because there's been a defense built for that attack.
I think it's a fair point. I mean, there are just, unfortunately, so many ways one can imagine destructive scenarios. It may, hey, we're just attacking a bank, but we're actually disrupting the financial system. we're just attacking a shipping company, but we're bringing the unloading of all ship traffic to a halt. We're just attacking somebody that we are first going after, but because of the way we've created the technology, it ends up taking down hospitals and disrupting surgical operations in the middle of them. I mean, there's just, I believe, too much at stake to start drawing lines and say, let's not worry too much.
We got time for just one or two more.
Hi, Bill Nitze. You may have just answered my question, but I want to make sure. There are key authoritarian governments, Russia, China, Turkey, it's actually quite a long list, that see the use of cyber attacks as a non-proportional way to attack the liberal order and undermine the power of the United States. And in my view, they're doing it intentionally. And I understand why they're doing it intentionally. Now, how do we persuade those governments to enter into the kind of rulemaking that you've been talking about? Now, I think you've suggested an answer, and that is that the ability of governments of any kind to operate in the world can be undermined by non-governmental actors that are doing the things you described. And if that is indeed the answer I think it is, how do we use that answer to actually get bad actors like Vladimir Putin or Mr. Erdogan or the Ministry of State Security in China, long list, to cooperate in the kind of rule-based liberal order that we're seeking to create?
I think that it's a great question, and it fundamentally is one of the great, I'll almost argue, imponderables that has been an inherent part of arms limitations or control since that concept was first invented. Because what people naturally say, for good reason, is, but how can this work when the irresponsible governments of the world, the ones that we are worrying about the most, are least likely to sign up? And it's a fair point. But I guess the answer that I would offer in part is this. Look, the government of Syria tomorrow could say, we renounce all international agreements that Syria has ever signed that prohibits the use of chemical weapons. That is not going to make life easier, I would argue, for the government of Syria, because the international community has established a norm over time that says chemical weapons are off limits.
So sanctions.
It creates the foundation for all kinds of things, whether it's public pressure, trade sanctions, the use of Tomahawk missiles in retaliation, UN military steps. But the legal bulwark by itself does none of that. But I'll argue that none of that is possible without getting that legal framework, that international consensus in place to begin with. And we don't yet have that framework in place today because we haven't yet even really started to talk about it.
I'm tempted to ask if someone has a very short question that will elicit a two-sentence answer, though on this topic I'm not sure that's possible. Let's try it.
First of all, thank you so much. This is the last question. This has been absolutely fantastic, and I'm really glad you're paying so much attention to these issues. I want to also ask a quick question about the non-hacking. You mentioned the kinds of disruption of our democracy, what the Guardian newspaper has been alleging about Trump and Brexit in terms of legitimate use of one of your competitors, I guess, Facebook. Well, I don't know if you're partners, whatever, it doesn't matter. A legitimate American tech company, legitimate use of it, nothing was illegal or had been banned, but to manipulate voters in critical states, to identify, target, and then Trump paid $6 million, Brexit got it for free as a demo or something. You said you're first responders. I think this is something the industry needs to sign up to, and I hear you in between the lines signing up to it, but I'd like to hear you say it out loud.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about what a specific company is or isn't doing or should or shouldn't be doing other than our own, and obviously your question wasn't about Microsoft. What I'll simply say to keep the answer short is this: technology is creating a variety of these different new challenges and issues. And I do think it's absolutely right that as an industry, we accept the first responsibility to rising to meet these challenges. Now, there are times when there are real trade-offs between, say, protection of the public and free expression that one needs to think hard about. It's not always black or white or black versus white. But I do think that our responsibility is very high. And I think we serve ourselves and the world best when we acknowledge that, when we act with a sense of humility and accept that we don't have all the answers, but we need to engage in a dialogue to figure things out. We need to figure out where we can act on our own, and we need to figure out then where we need governments to act so that we're acting but pursuant to law. And I think it's healthy that more of these issues are being raised. It's healthy that these conversations are taking place. What we need to do is do it in more places and start to make more progress.
And with that, thank you for the questions. And Brad, thank you for the insights. Really appreciate it.